Hi, everybody. Welcome to Odd Week Sunday School at St. Andrew's Covenant Presbyterian Church. It's good to have you with us. Our lesson today comes from the Gospel lectionary reading for this Sunday, which is from the first Gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22. So towards the end of the book, as the book is moving toward its climax. And the setting for this story, Matthew 22, verses 34 to 46, is right after Jesus has entered the city of Jerusalem in triumph, riding on his donkey, people waving palm branches, and some say, in fact, it's the next day. So maybe it's the Monday of Holy Week, or the Monday of the last week of Jesus' life. So that's the setting for our story. As you might remember, in that week, the religious leaders of the Jewish community in Jerusalem, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the scribes, the teachers of the law, as they're called, different things, they confronted Jesus many times during that week in an effort to challenge this, out-of-town, rabble-rousing teacher, maybe to bring him down a few pegs, trying to draw Jesus into controversy and clever verbal wrestling. So we get a lot of that in chapter 22. That's the setting. Now, the chapter, to talk a little bit about what happens right before the passage we want to take on today, Chapter 22 opens with Jesus telling a famous parable, a story about a wedding banquet. And after he tells that story, then he's confronted by these groups with some trick questions. And the text tells us these are test questions. They're hoping to expose Jesus either as someone who doesn't really know the scripture very well, or someone who's just a dangerous fraud. People are apparently always listening to these exchanges, so this is performed for an audience, these Q&As. So the first question here that Jesus gets after the story of the wedding banquet is a question from the Pharisees about whether it's right for Jews to pay taxes to Caesar, which is a tricky question. Then after that, he gets a question from a group called the Sadducees. The Sadducees did not believe in the prospect of resurrection, as some of the other Jews did. And so they gave Jesus a super convoluted question about a woman who was married 7 times to 7 different brothers. And then the question is, at the resurrection, whose wife will she be? Incidentally, I like to think that if a woman has been married 7 times, maybe in the life to come, she'll get a little break from marriage for a while, but that is really not the point of this story. So Jesus answers both of these questions about taxes and about the resurrection in such a way that the people interrogating him are sort of quieted, they're silenced, and they go away for a little while. So he gives them some pretty good answers. And then we get to this week's text. Some Pharisees come back around for another try with this itinerant preacher. They give him another question. And to this question, this is the topic of today's lesson, Jesus gives a profound answer, and then he asks a question of his own. So let's read the passage, Matthew 22, verses 34 to 46. And while I'm reading this passage about questions, think about this question. How does all this question asking function in the relationship between Jesus and the people that he's talking to? Okay, so here's the passage from the New Revised Standard Version from chapter 22 of Matthew. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? Jesus said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Now, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them this question: What do you think of the Messiah? Whose son is he? And they said to him, The son of David. He said to them, How is it then that David by the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, quote, The Lord said to my Lord, Sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet, unquote. If David thus calls him Lord, how can he be his son? No one was able to give him an answer, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. Okay, so that's our passage. Now the text tells us that the expert in the law who assigned this question to Jesus wanted to test him about what was the greatest commandment. You wonder, what kind of answer he expected, or whether the answer that he got satisfied him. I think what we're made to understand here is that the person asking Jesus this question didn't ask it really that sincerely. The people asking him this were sort of hoping to get him into trouble. They were hoping to get people to turn away from him. But even though Jesus knew that, he reacted to his interrogators, seriously enough to give them a very thoughtful answer. And maybe there's a lesson in here for us. This is a good way maybe to approach someone who asks us a question like this, insincerely. Matthew's always reminding us in this gospel that Jesus was a teacher. This is really the gospel that's about pedagogy. And a lot of teaching strategies are on display in the first gospel. Jesus uses questions to open conversations. He responds to questions for teachable moments. And most of the time, when Jesus is having one of these Q&As in the Gospel of Matthew, it's with a Pharisee. The Pharisaic Jews then, and even now, are people who believe that the way to deepen our understanding about God is by asking questions, specifically asking questions of the sacred scriptures and sacred texts, which the Pharisees believed included the writings of the rabbis who had commented on Torah in writing. And this is pretty much the approach that Jesus takes when he is teaching. He asks questions of sacred texts and gives sometimes surprising interpretations of them. He's showing us something here, isn't he? Jesus the teacher, something we try to teach in college, really. Everything we ever figure out, every fact we ever figure out, every correct interpretation we ever figure out is the answer to a question that we have learned how to ask. Answering questions is very important, and it's often very difficult. But there's no answering without asking first. The quality of the answers does depend on the quality of the questions. So if Jesus and the Pharisees had so much in common in the way that they tried to learn and to teach, why is Jesus so hard on them? Well, maybe for Jesus, it wasn't so much the way the Pharisees used their minds that he objected to as the way they used their hearts. Jesus often challenged the narrowness of their view of God, their eagerness to exclude rather than to include, their self-satisfaction and their closed-mindedness. If your mind is closed, not much can get in there, even if you do happen to ask a good question. But Jesus kept working on them. So this question about which is the greatest commandment, which is the most important commandment, was very much rooted in the rabbinic tradition. The Pharisees understood and had long debated that which of the commandments were the greater commandments and which were the lesser commandments. There are so many commandments in Torah. They talked about this, which are greater, which are lesser, although it wasn't permitted to break any of them. All right, so let's put questions aside for a minute and talk about an answer. The answer Jesus gave to this question. How did he answer this trick question, but good question about the greatest commandment? Well, he answered it He gave a two-part answer. The first part of his answer was also very much rooted in the rabbinic tradition, displaying, as it were, his chops as a biblical scholar and a pious Jew. Jesus offers them the Shema from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5, which the Jews believed was a commandment uttered by Moses on the eve of going into the promised land. That verse from Deuteronomy goes like this: "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength." So Jesus offers them, in answer to this question, a commandment that's so important and so well known to the Jews that they prayed it 2 times a day. They carried it around on their person. They wrote it on their doorposts. This was an absolutely unassailable answer to the question of what is the greatest commandment. But to this, Jesus took it upon himself to add something. The Pharisees had asked him for the greatest commandment. Jesus gave it to them, but then he added a second. And the second is like it, he said. Love your neighbor as yourself. Well, there he's also quoting Torah. That commandment comes from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. Now, Leviticus chapter 19, very interesting, well worth reading, is sort of a grab bag chapter about what it means to love your neighbor. Jesus, I think, picks a summary verse out of Leviticus 19, this one, love your neighbor as yourself. It sort of summarizes what's going on in the chapter, and he attaches it to the Shema about loving God. So one question and an answer in 2 parts. Jesus said that the 2 commandments are alike, so they're connected somehow, when he said that all the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. So his answer to this trick question was very rich. And surely there were some in that crowd who went home thinking this over. So if we think about this answer for a minute, isn't there, some song about, love is the answer? I know that must be in a song. Because love did seem to be Jesus' answer to the question about the greatest commandment. God's double commandment here is to love. Love God, love neighbor, even really love yourself. What does it mean to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind? What does it mean, especially if it is like, but not the same as loving your neighbor? Well, people have answered this question, what does it mean to love God, in various ways for a very long time. St. Augustine in the 5th century put it this way: "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless till it rests in you." So longing for God, seeking for God, feeling so connected to God that we're restless until we connect with him. In our own Presbyterian tradition, these are the words of the Westminster Shorter Catechism, which the older folks around here once memorized in their youth, I am told. Question number 1 in the Westminster Shorter Catechism is, what is the chief end of man? And the answer is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. So maybe to love God is to enjoy God. Maybe the steps that we take to loving God are much like the steps that we take to loving our own beloved people. We take an interest in them. We pay attention to them. We don't give up on them when they disappoint us. We open our hearts to them when we have to speak. We notice that we enjoy being in their company. So there's an answer to the question. But before this section concludes, before chapter 22 concludes, Jesus asks another question of them. And this one is maybe really a tricky question. After Jesus answers his test question, he asks them something that maybe seems at first like a non sequitur. Jesus asks what the Pharisees thought about the Messiah, or the Christ, 2 words for the same thing, the promised one of Israel who was to come. And good scripture students that the Pharisees were, they immediately answered, Messiah is the son of David. But Jesus, the gentle teacher, challenges their answer. And he quotes a section of the mysterious Psalm 110. When teacher Jesus does that, this is what perceptive students will notice as a way of telling them they got the answer wrong. At least partly wrong. So Jesus quotes a little piece of Psalm 110, challenging the idea that the Messiah is the son of David, because in this psalm, the psalmist calls Messiah the Lord. So kind of the unarticulated point of Jesus' second question is that Messiah is the Son of God. In the Davidic line, but the Son of God. Something that God had declared at the Transfiguration, that Peter had already declared previously in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 16, something that the high priest who was about to interrogate Jesus would show that he believed as well. So Jesus left them to the conclusion, find that conclusion on their own if they could. But why did Jesus ask this question about whose son was the Messiah? In the context of telling them that the greatest commandment was love, to love God whole-lifedly. I'm not sure. But maybe love is the answer. Jesus was 4 days away from being crucified when he told them this. He was going to be crucified for the claim that he was the Messiah, the Son of God. And the crucifixion was something that Jesus would undertake out of love for God and love for his neighbor. Maybe he was telling them here that the Messiah, the Son of God, would be in a position to evaluate the quality of love these people directed toward God and neighbor. And that it was the quality of love for God and neighbor that revealed true understanding of the law and its commandments. Well, something to think about. Next time, I'll see you in 1 week instead of 2 weeks, because we have 2 odd weeks in a row. So on November 1st, I hope to see you again. Until then, be well.